Alright, today we have a couple of 80 series Land Cruisers in. They're currently fitted with a 1FZ manual. And I'll be fitting a cammed ls1 to this one. And this green one will receive a cammed 6 litre. So as per usual, the first thing we need to do is get these motors out. We've got both of the engines out, and the next thing to do is clean up the engine bay. Being a four-wheel drive, they're always filthy, so we usually pressure wash them first. We also need to remove a few of the unwanted things from the engine bay, and get it ready for putting in the LS. A few of the things we need to do before the motor can go in is to move the AC line that's on the firewall out of the way, relocate all of the fuel lines to the top of the chassis rail, and this driver side engine mount is too wide for the AC compressor, so we'll need to cut that in half and weld the side back on. I'll go over that shortly, but first we'll have a look at the kit that Marks adapters make. This is the kit for the 80 series manual. It comes with a bell housing adapter and backing plate, the flywheel spacer, the engine mounts and engine mount brackets. The flex plate doesn't come in the kit, but it's just a standard 6L80 flex plate. And then we have the flex plate stiffener, all of the hardware you need, along with the coolant and oil pressure sensor adapters. And finally we have the clutch kit. It comes with two different size spigot bearings for some reason, but I'll use the one on the left. The flex plate has two round holes and one slotted hole, which you'll need to drill out to a round hole, otherwise the bolt won't fit. Once the hole's drilled out, you can fit the flex plate stiffener to the back of the flex plate. And to align the two, use the supplied tool. Once it's all bolted together, you want to make sure that you can still get it in and out easy. I've got the engine mounts fitted and the backing plate on the engine, as well as the new flywheel studs. Make sure to use Loctite on these and clean off any residue before you fit the flex plate. I've got the flex plate fitted to the studs now, and the spacer slides over the top. I'll need to torque these down now, and we'll check it for alignment. I've got my dial indicator set up on the end of the spacer now, and as you can see we've got very little run out, well within spec, so we should be fine here. Sometimes they are a little bit out and you just need to back them off and retorque them. Once you're happy you got the spacer aligned, you can fit the flywheel with the supplied bolts, and then you can fit the spigot bearing. You'll need to tap these two dowels into the new bell housing adapter. The smaller one goes on the left hand side, and the brass coloured one goes on the right hand side. Moving on to the engine mounts, I've cleaned it up a little bit with a flap disc, and I've marked out where I need to cut. The instructions say 50mm from the back of the rear hole, and I'll cut along the side and down through this weld as well. To make life much easier, I've unbolted the steering box and zip tied it up out the way. Before I cut this, I'll show you the underside because there's a couple other bits as well. It also has this reinforcement plate underneath. The top piece you can just cut in half, but the bottom one you'll need to zip this weld as well. Alright, I've cut off half the mount now and as close to the welds as I can without touching the chassis rail. I've also still got the reinforcement plate to cut off, and I'll come back here with a flap disc and grind back all of these welds. Once I've got it cleaned up and the reinforcement plate out of the way, I'll take the side that I've cut off and I'll tack it back to the side of the mount. I've got everything cleaned up now and the side tacked back on. I also ground back the tack so I can just come through and finish weld it out. I finished welding it and cleaned up the top, just need some black paint and we'll move on to the heat shield. Before you fit the heat shield you need to move all the fuel lines to the top of the chassis rail, and once you do you can use the heat shield supplied from Marks and you just have to drill and tap a few holes in the chassis rail. And the second heat shield they supply just bolts to the chassis rail here and goes underneath the engine mount. We've got the engine bay cleaned up now and I've painted up the engine mount. We've also cleaned the bell housing out and fitted the new throwout bearing, along with moving the hard AC line up out the way, and the section where it used to run you just need to dent in slightly with a mallet, otherwise the head will be hitting hard up on it. I've got the cross member off and cleaned it up a little bit, because on these manuals you need to slot the holes 25mm to move the transfer case assembly forward. Usually I do this with a die grinder, but I've got a cool new toy I'd like to try out. I've pulled a few slats out of the table so the cross member will fit, and I wrote a little program in Fusion 360 to cut these holes out. Because this is still new to me, I'm going to run a trial run and see how it goes. Looks good to me, we'll fire it up and see how it goes. That worked out pretty good. I'll get this off the table and clean it up, get a bit of paint on it and we'll have a look. The paint's still wet, but that's a lot neater than I could have done with the die grinder. We've got our engine mounts and brackets on, along with our AC rear location brackets. We'll leave the compressor off for now. And we've fitted our coolant temp sensor adapter and the original sender out of the old motor. And on the other side we've got our alternator relocation and our other engine mount bracket. I've I've also fitted the Marks modified sump. If you don't use the modified one, you won't have any clearance for your drag link. All of our adapters and clutch kits ready to go, along with the oil pressure adapter and senders. We're all done with the motor now, and it's ready to go into the car. This engine will be getting fitted to the green 80 series. We've got all the engine bay prepped up, but before we do that, we'll have a look at the ls1 that's going in the other 80 series. This is a cammed ls1 that I've rebuilt. We've got another modified Marks sump fitted, and I've painted the engine and all the accessories black. Since the engine mounts are zinc coated, I didn't bother with them. We've got another bell housing adapter and clutch kit fitted to this engine, and this combo will be fitted to the 80 series behind me. I've done the engine mount mod and all the other bits and pieces I needed to, so this one's ready to go in as well. Alright, so we got the 6 litre and the green 80 series. I've also fitted the power steering hoses and the extractors, so I guess we'll go over that on the bench. For both of these conversions we're using the stainless steel extractor kit from Marks. These don't come with a crossover pipe or an exhaust, so we'll have to make that. This is an off-the-shelf mild steel 3-inch exhaust for a Land Cruiser. I've cut from the centre muffler forward off of the exhaust because we don't need it, and I weld a 3-inch 2-bolt flange to the end. The tailpipe in this small piece will just remain how it was. It comes with all the hardware you need, and I've got a set of 3-inch 100 cell high flow cats. So I'll get that fitted to the car and make up the centre section. I've welded up 2 individual cat pipes that run either side of the gearbox, and made a crossover pipe that merges behind the transfer case. If you want to see how I do this, I go over it in my other 80 series Land Cruiser video. I'll leave a link in the description. I've got the cat pipes and the rest of the exhaust fitted up, and again I've recorded this after the dyno run, that's why the cats have some discoloration, but the ceramic coating I use seems to hold up quite well. I've removed the senders out of both of the cars, and since these were petrol we don't need to wash out the tanks. And these Raceworks EP501s are almost a direct replacement. If these were diesel, you'd need these terminals that go through the lid of the senders. I've got specific in-tank fuel hose for hooking up the new fuel pumps. I'll get these old pumps out of here and get the new ones fitted, and I'll come back to you. I've got both of the new Raceworks fuel pumps fitted, along with some new fuel line. As I said, these are direct replacements, so there's no modification required. The only thing you'll need to do is install the new wiring. The power wire they come with is never long enough, so I've got a roll of red wire here and made new wires from the fuel pump up to the lid. As usual, I'll use these 3-port fuel regulators and a couple of Z200 fuel filters. The regs get mounted to the firewall and they use 3 different size fittings, a 6, an 8 and a 10mm. I'll show you how to hook up the lines once it's mounted. The 10mm runs to the fuel rail and the other 2 run back to the factory lines. Underneath the car, just in front of the fuel tank, is where I mount the fuel filter. I cut and flare the main fuel line and add the filter between. Next we'll move on to the cooling system. I've got a brand new radiator for this one, and I've cut down a set of VZ SS fans. I've only had to take the front lip off and make little cutouts for the new brackets. And I've also drilled a couple of holes for those brackets to mount. Apart from that, the fans just slide onto the radiator, and the bottom of the fan shroud just clips into the factory radiator clips. On the top side of the radiator, I just need to make a couple of rectangle brackets with 4 holes in them, and then I can mount the fan shroud up to the factory mounting points on the radiator. I usually just make these by hand, but I have the perfect tool for the job. Paint's still a little bit wet again, but you get the idea. Had to put a little bend in the larger one to match the angle of the fan. But once those are dry, I'll bolt that up. But while we wait for that, I've already got the other one ready. You can see how the brackets just bolt up to the fans. And on the bottom side, the factory clips just hold the bottom of the fan shroud. The metal tank one on the left has all the same mounting points as the plastic one on the right. I'll get both of these fitted up to the car and we'll go over the radiator hoses. For the top hose, I'm using one from a VXSS cut in half with our bypass adapter for the head bleed pipe. How long the hose is will depend if you have a left or right hand water pump outlet. And the bottom hose is for a 6-cylinder EB Falcon. It's a little bit long on one end, so we just need to chop it down a little bit. And finally, we'll need a length of 16mm heater hose. Now I've got all the cooling system plumbed up, we'll go over the hoses. Down here we have the EB Falcon bottom hose, and then we've got 2 lengths of the heater hose that run up to the firewall. From the other side you can see our top hose and bypass adapter, and the hose that runs over to the head bleed pipe. Here you can see the modified power steering hose that runs along the frame rail and back up to the power steering pump. And we have the feed and return line that runs back up to the res. And that's about it for this one. We'll quickly go and have a look at the other one because that's almost the same. And here we have the ls1 variant. Everything so far has been just about the same. There are a couple of differences between the two and we'll go over that shortly. But as you can see, all of the cooling system, the power steering hose, fuel reg, all of that's the same as the 6 litre. We've got the transfer case up on the bench because this one here has a full-time forward drive system. And we're going to be removing the centre diff and fitting this spool assembly. So I'll remove this first section of the transfer case and we'll go over how it's done. I've got the back off the transfer case now, and over here we've got a couple of shims that come out. You need to be careful you don't mix these up or forget to put them back in. And now we can dive even deeper into the transfer case. I've pulled this cover off the left hand side, and behind it you'll find this circlip that you'll need to remove to get the cover over the bearing. And once that's off, we can take the rest of the bolts out and get this next section off. I've got the transfer case further apart. When this plate comes off, it doesn't usually take this shaft with it, that's why we take the circlip off, but this one just didn't want to come, so there it stays. Over here I've removed all of the bolts out of the centre diff, and we can just slide this out. Once that's off, we've got to remove the spider gears and we can fit the spooled centre. I've got the new spool fitted now and all bolted down, as well as the new bearing pressed on. Over here is what you should have left over, the spider gears, this shim, and the old housing and bearing. Now that I've got that fitted, I can reassemble the transfer case. Now the transfer case is done, we need to remove these plates that lock the axle to the hub. Once the bolts and circlip is removed, you can slide it right off. After that you can fit the new gasket, and then the new hub adapter that's supplied with the kit. You need to pull the axle all the way out and fit the correct size spacer, they give you 2 different sizes in the kit, and then fit the circlip and gasket. And once we've got all that done, you can fit the new locking hub. Now instead of being full-time forward drive, we can lock and unlock the front diff from the hubs. And now we start moving into the variants between the 6 litre and the ls1. This harness is for the ls1 and it's been modified from Allen at Calmaker. The few wires over here are for the tacho, ignition and fuel pump. The 2 blue wires are our twin fan outputs, and the red wire is the main power that feeds from the alternator. The rest of the harness will plug into the engine just like normal. And this is the 6 litre harness for the E38 ECU. It's the same as the ls1 with all of the fuses and relays built into the harness. And here we have the length of wire for the fuel pump, the engine light, the ignition and the tacho. This red one's for main power, the 2 blue are for the fans. And this black one here is the main earth for the harness. And the rest will just plug in the engine the same. For the main earth and the battery cable, I'll be using the Nava 32 square mil 255 amp cable again. I've got crimp on cable lugs for all of them, and brand new battery terminals as well. I've got both of the engine looms off and laid out here on the floor. The top loom I've stripped all of the tape and cable sleeving off so we can see the inside. Majority of this engine side is going to go, but we need this wire here that runs down to the coolant temp sensor, this bunch of earths, and the plug that goes back to the gearbox. All of the grey plugs on the right that used to go to the ECU will get deleted, and we'll keep those two white plugs that go back into the body loom. I've stripped everything out of the engine harness that we don't need. I've left these bunch of earths here, along with the gearbox plug, and the wire that runs to the coolant temp sensor. This black wire with the white trace is for the starter motor trigger. All of those wires that I've cut out the back of the plugs I'll now de-pin and wrap these harnesses back up. I've fitted the loom to the ls1 and run all of the fuses and relays inside the cab along with the ECU. And I've terminated these wires with a plug that goes to the fuel pump. The pink wire goes off to the ignition, and this brown and yellow wire is for the tacho. It used to be black, but I accidentally de-pinned it, so I just run the brown wire straight from this plug into the white plug. And I've also de-pinned all of the other unnecessary wires. The other white plug that goes in the body loom only needs this single yellow wire. On the 6 litre I've done the same thing and run all the fuses and relays inside the cab. As you can see, I've still got the black tacho wire running into this plug. The same as the other one, I've terminated the fuel pump, ignition, tacho and engine light wiring. Now we'll just mount all this stuff up behind the dash and we'll go over the battery cable. On the starter motor I've got the cable running down from the battery, and the trigger wire is that black with white trace that we looked at before. With the engine loom and battery cabling all fitted now, we'll quickly go over everything. I've terminated the thermofan wiring with a new plug and run our 2 blue wires from the engine loom and a couple of earths. The original plug for the alternator on the passenger side just needs to be extended, and that goes straight into the ls1 alternator. The new engine loom goes through the firewall on the passenger side and gets sealed up with a grommet. And that should be just about it for the wiring. Next up we'll go over the ls1 throttle cable and the fly-by-wire setup on the ls2. For the ls1 setup I like to use a VS 5 litre Commodore throttle cable. With the old cable removed, this will just go straight through the firewall and hook onto the throttle pedal. And it has the correct ends to bolt onto the manifold and hook up to the throttle body. We'll also be running this one MAF-less, so we only need an intake temp sensor for the intake. Here we have the 6 litre, this just has the fly-by-wire throttle body, and we're going to retain the MAF sensor on this one for better fuel economy, so there's no need for a separate intake temp sensor. Since the throttle body is fly-by-wire, we need to fit the correct pedal. I won't take over to the plasma, but I've made up a bracket that bolts to the floor and the pedal bolts to that. Since I have the CAD file and it takes 2 minutes for the plasma to cut them out, I may even end up selling these brackets. Alright, now we've got both of these finished, we'll start this one up and you can have a bit of a listen, and then we'll back both of them on the dyno and see what numbers they make. that's not bad. 304 from the ls1 and 312 from the 6 litre. They both should be pretty happy with that. We'll take one last walk around just before we go. Let me know in the comments whether you prefer the unpainted or the painted engine. Myself personally, I paint all of my engines black, but it's personal preference, I guess. And for those that stuck around to the end, I'll leave you with the sound of a couple of cammed LS's, and as always, thanks for watching.